All right, welcome everybody to ADHD in Girls, recognizing the symptoms and providing support. My name is Christy Moore, and I'm the Family to Family Health Information Center Program Lead with ECAC. And today I am super happy and excited to be joined by Dr. Julia Schechter and Dr. Maura DeVito. They are both from the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD. And I am super interested to hear everything they have to say because girls and ADHD is definitely going to be an interesting topic. So just before we get started, real quick, couple things. So this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording along with the slides and any additional information the presenters would like to share will be sent in a follow-up email. I will probably get that out on Monday, Tuesday morning at the very latest, but my goal is Monday. So by Monday afternoon. We hope that you guys have questions. But please put all your questions in the Q&A section that's located probably at the bottom of your screen. I think sometimes it's at the top for some folks. But the chat gets bogged down with conversation or comments or whatever, which we love that too. But we want to make sure that we can clearly see your questions. So go ahead and make sure those go in the Q&A. Feel free to put questions in the Q&A at any time during the presentation, but we are going to address those at the end to make sure our presenters have enough time to get through all of their material. And due to the large number of attendees, we won't be able to unmute participants to talk. But if you have additional questions or you have very specific personal questions related to your personal situations, we really don't want to talk about those publicly, but feel free to send me an email. And if it's appropriate for me to connect you to Julia or Maura, I will. And towards the end, I will launch a real quick poll. I think it's like 4 multiple choice questions. And that is it. Without further ado, I would like to go ahead and turn it over. Let me stop sharing.
I'm gonna share mine.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay. Does that look okay? Perfect.
Yep.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here and for Christy for inviting us to speak. We are just really thrilled to be able to speak with you all. And it was really exciting seeing all the places in North Carolina that people are watching this from. It's just really exciting. Just briefly, these are Maura and my disclosures on where we get our funding from. We want to start with seeing if these sound like familiar scenarios to anyone here. The first is your second grader is bouncing off the walls as soon as she wakes up, from the couch to the floor, to the chair, to the door, and she has a really hard time following those daily routines of putting on socks, shoes, and getting her backpack. You end up having to repeat yourself a lot. Second scenario is your middle schooler has homework and it's just really hard to get started and then really hard to stay focused on the homework. And this is leading to a lot of nightly battles. Third scenario, your high schooler has a big term paper to do, and there are a lot of steps involved. And knowing what steps to do, getting started, getting them done is really, really challenging. This is leading to a lot of procrastination and a lot of late nights. We can't see your faces to know if these are examples that resonate with you, but we would imagine if you're here today that at least one of those scenarios does, as this all could be related to ADHD. And that is what the goals of our presentation today are, to talk about ADHD and specifically talk about the presentation that we often see in girls. We also want to share what we know and also what we don't know based on available research. And then we're going to use the second half of the talk to talk about some practical tips for supporting youth with ADHD at home and at school. We know we have a really wide audience on the call today, which again is really exciting. We are hopeful that the tips that we'll be able to provide you will be useful to you regardless of the hat that you wear. We are coming to you from the Duke Center for Girls and Women with ADHD. This is an initiative that is housed within the Department of Psychiatry at Duke. And it was funded initially by a private donation from a family who had firsthand experiences of the challenges that the girls with ADHD can face. And they were eager to fund a center that really focused on education, outreach, and research all in the service of enhancing the lives of girls and women living with ADHD and the people who love them. So that is our mission at the center. We work to achieve this mission by providing resources on our website and through our social media. We also also try to, we develop our own resources, but we also really love to promote and push out good stuff that we see from other folks across the world who are doing evidence-based work. So you'll see that kind of thing on our platforms as well. This is some of our team, not all of our team, but some of our team. We are a group of psychologists and public health experts and researchers and clinicians. And then we have a really enthusiastic and wonderful group of volunteers who helps us as well. And importantly, we always like to mention that the center is committed to enhancing the lives of all individuals who identify as female, regardless of their sex assigned at birth. So just to start, level set of what is ADHD? So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It is a neurodevelopmental, or that's a fancy way of saying brain-based condition that causes inattention, hyperactivity, and or impulsivity at a level that exceeds what we would expect for someone's development. We really think of ADHD as a disorder of regulation. So being able to regulate your attention to the thing that you really need to focus on, or regulate your behavior to meet the expectations of the environment, is really impaired. Estimates range depending on what samples you're looking at, but around 10% of children, adolescents, and around 4% of adults in the United States meet criteria for ADHD. We don't know exactly what causes ADHD, but what our research really does tell us is that it tends to run in families, and there really is a genetic basis for ADHD. What it's not caused by is too much sugar or lax parenting or too much TV. That does not cause ADHD. Symptoms of ADHD first emerge during childhood, but they often last across the lifetime. And that's reflected in the diagnostic criteria. So what we're really looking for when we are making a diagnosis of ADHD is a really persistent pattern of challenges with attention or hyperactivity or impulsivity that really last across time and across settings. This isn't just having problems some of the time or even having a few problems consistently. This is a really pervasive difficulty with symptoms really occurring much more than we would expect for someone's age or level of development. We also have to make sure when we're making a diagnosis that these symptoms are not better accounted for by another condition. And I know that was kind of coming up in the earlier conversation of how do you parse this stuff apart, and it is really tricky to do. I just wanted to put up here some of the specific symptoms of attention and hyperactive impulsive behavior that we look for when we're making a diagnosis. And you can see some of these things on here that may or may not sound familiar. On the inattention side, we're really looking at difficulty sustaining attention, trouble staying focused, not seeming to listen, difficulty organizing. On the hyperactive impulsive side, we're talking a lot about, having a lot of excessive energy, running around, trouble staying, lots of talkativeness. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking for. And depending on the symptom presentation, how many symptoms you have, that dictates what type of ADHD you get diagnosed with. You can see there's 3 different types: predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive, impulsive, and combined. What type you get, it shifts, right? We know this is a disorder that can look different across time and across settings. Thinking about ADHD in girls specifically, what we know historically is that girls and women with ADHD have often been misdiagnosed with other conditions before ADHD is recognized. We also know that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what ADHD is, and this is misunderstanding by patients themselves, by the public, but also by professionals and educators. And part of the reason is that the vast majority of research that has been done on ADHD has really has used predominantly male samples. And this has really centered our understanding of the clinical presentation on the male presentation. And so this has leads to just a misunderstanding of what this can look like in girls and women. Ultimately, we end up seeing a lot of missed opportunities for intervening around ADHD. And we'll talk a little bit about intervention today. But before we're able to intervene, we really have to be able to know who has ADHD, and that can be hard to do in girls. We also know that ADHD is something that can really get in people's way. We often say at the center that ADHD isn't just losing your keys sometimes, right? This is something that really, when left untreated, can have some pretty significant impacts for people. Specifically for girls, we see some kind of unique harms associated with being a girl with ADHD. So increased rates of anxiety and depression, challenges socially. So this can be difficulties in friendships, vulnerable to bullying. We see increased rates of eating disorders, teen pregnancies, unplanned pregnancies, earlier sexual activity. We see greater things, externalizing behaviors, things like greater levels of oppositional defiant disorder. We also see greater rates of suicide and self-harm. Again, the good news is that we have interventions that can really mitigate these risks, but we can't intervene if we don't know who has ADHD. And the presentation of ADHD in girls can look different from what people typically think of when they think of ADHD, again, based on just the research that's been done has really had our understanding on the male presentation. So what does it look like in girls? So what things that we often see is that girls with ADHD often have more of those inattentive symptoms compared to the hyperactive and impulsive behavior. So they tend to look a little bit more spacey or have trouble staying focused rather than that sort of really high levels of running around and what we think about when we think about hyperactive behavior. In addition, when girls have a hyperactive and impulsive behavior, their symptoms tend to be more subtle. So one of the things that we see is kind of more hyperverbal behavior rather than that hyperactive behavior. Girls with ADHD are at risk for more co-occurring conditions. So things like anxiety and depression often co-occur with ADHD, which can make it really tricky to parse it all apart. We also know that ADHD symptoms in girls can sometimes become more apparent to others kind of later in childhood compared to boys, where it's a little bit more obvious earlier on. The symptoms also tend to become more apparent at times of transition, so starting a new school year or transitioning to high school or transitioning to college. Girls with ADHD often come up with some pretty elaborate coping strategies and kind of masking their symptoms. And it's those times of transitions when we often start to see those masks come off, right? They can't compensate as well. Girls tend to, for all of these reasons, tend to be diagnosed around 4 to 5 years later than boys and men. And so that obviously, again, delays the possibility of intervening earlier. And we also know there's additional challenges when we start to think about girls of color. And this is a really understudied area, but we know that just adds to the complexity of trying to identify these girls. An interesting piece of research that I wanted to share today is that we do have some emerging evidence that hormones seems to play a role in ADHD presentation. We know that just low estrogen in general can impact brain functioning, particularly when it comes to things related to executive functioning, which Dr. DeVito will be talking about a little bit more in just a little while. And we know that hormones fluctuate over the course of the menstrual cycle and also over the course of the reproductive lifespan. And those fluctuations can be linked to mood and other and depression and psychopathology. So it stands to reason that ADHD might have a connection to hormones as well. And in fact, some preliminary research is finding a connection between fluctuating hormones, particularly estrogen and ADHD symptoms. So this is one paper that came out that actually showed that lower estrogen was related to higher rates of ADHD symptoms. And they saw these fluctuations over the course of the menstrual cycle. Again, this is early days for this kind of research, but it really is an exciting avenue that's starting to be explored. When we start to look at prevalence rates of ADHD, boys are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD in early childhood or just childhood in general. So rates, again, vary depending on the sample, but around 3 to 1, so 3 boys to every 1 girl is diagnosed in childhood. Interestingly, when you look at adulthood, we see more of a 1-to-1 ratio. So women and men are just as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. We don't know exactly why this pattern exists, but one thought is that one thought is that when you're a kid, you really are depending on other people to notice your difficulties and then make referrals to the right people to get evaluated. And we know there are inequities when it comes to just rates of referral and also what happens during the referral process. So first, we have research to show that parents and teachers often rate ADHD symptoms in girls differently. There's research when they're presented with the same scenario, but just change the names to a girl or a boy. Parents and teachers are less likely to indicate that something is ADHD if the name has a girl on it. Again, the symptoms that girls show are just less overt. Girls are not typically, not always, but typically the ones that are disrupting the classroom, right? They're the more ones kind of sitting in the back and staring out the window. They're not causing significant problems, and therefore they're not really rising to the level often of referrals. We also know, again, that they often mask and compensate for their difficulties. So for all of those reasons, we often don't see girls getting referred as frequently. This is an interesting study that actually looked at this more carefully. They had 50 girls diagnosed with ADHD and 50 boys, and they looked back and saw what were the presenting concerns. And what they found was that girls were more likely to be referred for emotional disorders versus boys who are more likely to be referred for neurodevelopmental concerns. Girls were older at the time of their first visit. It also took a longer time, so more sessions of evaluation to determine that a girl had ADHD compared to boys. Also, interestingly, the girls, once they were diagnosed, they were less likely to be prescribed the standard medication for ADHD, which is stimulant medication. Thinking about assessment, what do we do during assessments during childhood? This is what goes into a kind of the recommendations for what goes into an ADHD evaluation. People might be looking at this and thinking, wait a second, that's not what happened when my child got evaluated. And there are different ways, different practices that people use depending on the setting they're in. But I do like to review, especially for people who might be just starting this journey of getting their child diagnosed, what goes into an evaluation. The first thing we have to think about is doing a clinical interview with the kid and the family, really understanding how have these symptoms looked over time. We also want to get standardized rating scales to really understand how the symptoms that kids are showing kind of compare to other kids of similar age, and also ideally of the same sex if possible. And we want these ratings to come from multiple informants. So getting both parents and teachers and potentially other raters like coaches, other people who know your child well can be really helpful, because we do need to establish that these symptoms are happening across settings. A psychiatric evaluation to really understand, are there co-occurring conditions that may or may not better explain ADHD is also an important piece of it. If indicated, psychoeducational testing can be incorporated, and psychoeducational testing is that kind of, can be IQ testing, it can be looking at thinking and reasoning skills, but it's not something that has to be done to diagnose ADHD. I wanted to put one thing up here too, that this is one of the infographics that lives on our website. It can be really confusing to know who can diagnose ADHD, who can treat, like where do you go? And we recently published this guide to who can treat and diagnose. And so you can find that on our website, which may be helpful. So just briefly, I want to go over some information about ADHD treatment. There's a lot out there, first of all, as you may know, about what claims to kind of treat ADHD. We don't currently have conclusive evidence to support things like chiropractic treatments or food allergy treatments or play therapy to really improve ADHD symptoms. We have some emerging evidence looking at computer-based working memory training and digital therapeutics. There's some video games that can help train your brain, neurofeedback, biofeedback, and mindfulness meditation. So again, some emerging evidence there. But what we really have the strongest evidence base to support when we're managing ADHD symptoms is medication management and psychosocial and behavioral interventions. And really what we find is the combination of medication and therapy really yields the strongest results in terms of managing ADHD symptoms. So just to review this briefly, I know there's a lot in this talk that we can't dive into more, but we certainly will look forward to questions at the end. But just briefly thinking about medication. So stimulant medication is the frontline treatment for ADHD. The American Academy of Pediatrics really has this as their first treatment when someone's diagnosed if someone is ages 6 or above. And we know that medication has been found to be really effective at reducing ADHD symptoms when the medicine is in your system, and also reducing those negative outcomes. So some of those negative outcomes that I showed on the screen a couple of slides ago, we can see that those can be really mitigated when we have proper treatment. Interestingly, when we look at sex differences, we don't at the moment have anything to indicate that we would treat girls differently when it comes to medication or therapy when they have ADHD. But we do have some indication, or we do have data to show that girls with ADHD tend to be prescribed medication less often compared to boys with ADHD. And there is some indication that they're, from a meta-analysis, that they may respond a little bit differently to medications, but that really needs to be replicated with larger samples. On the psychosocial and behavioral intervention side, when we think about kind of elementary school age kids, typically the intervention that we're thinking about is something called behavioral parent training or parent management training. And what this does is really work with parents and caregivers to help sort of manage the environment in such a way that kids with ADHD can better meet the expectations. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just in a second. As kids get older, there's definitely still some parent and caregiver involvement, but we do start to shift the onus more to kids themselves and helping them start to track the things that they have to keep track of and to help to advocate for themselves. And Maura's going to talk a bit more about that in the second half of the talk. I also just want to repeat again very clearly that at the moment, there's no sex-specific differential response to behavior therapy or medication. There's no recommendations to treat kids differently who have ADHD based on their sex or their gender. Before we transition to talking more about kind of some of the skills that Dr. DeVito is going to talk about, I did wanted to show the model for behavior therapy that we often use, and it's this ABC model: antecedent, behavior, consequence. And what we're really thinking about here when it comes to antecedents is thinking about, okay, what is happening before my child does something or doesn't do something? What was going on in the environment? What do I know as the expert in my child that they're likely or not likely to do? And how can I, as the parent or caregiver or teacher, set the stage for a certain behavior to happen more or less often? The behavior is what your kid does, right? Consequence is what happens after a behavior that's going to, again, influence the likelihood of that behavior happening or not happening. Consequence is just what happens next. It's not necessarily negative, even though that's typically where our brain goes. It's really just something that happens that influences the likelihood of this behavior happening more often or less often. And so this is really the model that we use when it comes to the behavioral therapies that we're using with kids with ADHD. And what we're going to transition to now, though, is Dr. DeVito is going to talk a little bit about executive functioning coaching, which we are talking about today because, one, just to be really clear, is that executive functioning coaching is not currently one of the evidence-based interventions that I just had on the screen. So we just want to be really clear about that. However, we thought it was good to talk about today because it does draw on those same principles that I just showed you, as well as some other evidence-based treatments. And really, our goal today was to provide some really practical tips for parents and teachers who are working with kids with ADHD who we know often have those executive functioning challenges. You do not need to be a coach or mental health professional to utilize these strategies. So we really want to make sure that they were accessible for as many people as could possibly be. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and I'm going to let Dr. DeVito share her slides, and she's going to talk a little bit more specifically about what to do to help support kids with executive functioning challenges and ADHD.
Can everybody see? You can see, good. And can you hear? At least for Julia. Excellent.
Yep, you're good.
Good. And if you see me like looking around a bunch, it's because I have many screens up right now in order to do this presentation. So again, hi, thank you everyone for coming. My name is Maura, and I am a developmental psychologist. So I'm going to jump in with some developmental information about executive functions and then some practical information of how we can sort of build those skills and address those skills. So we know that executive functioning development is a very long developmental period of time. It takes a child's whole life into young adulthood to develop. And then in ADHD, it can be delayed up to 3 to 5 years, more so. So if you think about having a 10-year-old with ADHD, we might actually, in terms of their executive skills, be functioning, more like, 10-year-old or something. And so some of the skills that can be challenged include things like managing their time, being aware of time, how long things take, planning for that time, being organized, having systems of organization, knowing where things are and how to go about things, or using their working memory. And I just, at the bottom of each of these slides, you'll have some little resources and links. So Dr. Russell Barkley talks a lot about executive functioning and ADHD. I put a little YouTube link in there if you want to chase that down. So there is this connection of executive functions and ADHD that may be delayed up to 30%. And I'm just going to find my, okay, there we go. So what is executive functioning? It's a set of cognitive processes and skills. And the goal of those is to support the ability to regulate our behavior and persist to achieve our goals. And so, for example, some of those cognitive processes or skills might be attending to important information tasks, planning and organizing your activities and behavior, ignoring competing demands and distractions. So we're trying to optimize our behavior, our thinking, our attention, and our emotional experience. I want to put this out there right now so you have these resources and also to frame the rest of this talk. I was trained with Dr. Peg Dawson and Richard Ware a couple years ago, and I was interested in learning more about executive function coaching in elementary and secondary students. And so I took a course with them for a year. And these are some of their many books and skills that I'm going to be highlighting the skills and the strategies from their book. So this is their material and work. It's very accessible. There are some books geared more toward educators and or coaches, and there's some that are geared more toward parents. But I'm going to present like the general model that they propose and that they actually actualize. And because I think they're very doable, potentially, model that could generalize to different ages. I also did a parent coaching course for parents of children with ADHD with Cindy Goldrich. And so that's that last resource, 8 Keys to Parenting Children with ADHD. She talks a lot about the relational factors and sort of building a foundation of connection with your child and collaboration and communication. And I think that complements very nicely, like you have to have that relationship in order to build those executive skills with your child, because it's a process. It's not, here's a tool, just go use it. It's a process of teaching them how to use the tools. So this is all credit to them, and I hope to just impart some of their great wisdom today so that you can follow it more on your own and have some handy resources. So as I said, executive functioning develops across a long period of time. We know it takes time for children to develop language, right? It starts with little bitty babbling and moves, and it starts even before that when they're just listening to words, right? It takes a long time for children to develop sophisticated language. It takes time for children to develop their motor skills. You know, you don't just start walking, you start with lifting your head and being on your belly and then sitting up and rolling. And so the same is true for executive functioning, except it truly develops into young adulthood, into your into your 20s. And so across this long period of development, this slide just highlights where some of these skills start to come online, but it doesn't mean they're finished. It means like they're just starting, and you need a whole lifetime of experience and interaction in homes and school and in social relationships to build these skills. Okay, and sorry. And so the idea here is that, yes, the brain, the frontal lobes, this part of the brain is sort of the seat physiologically, biologically of these executive skills. However, they don't just grow on their own in the brain. They need food, they need nourishment, right? So just as your baby needs to be fed what sometimes feels like every 2 seconds, or your toddler or your growing teen, to meet that need for their physical growth, their brain growth needs interaction and relationship, and it needs support. And so that's where any of you as educators and or parents come in your role. So when we start off in life, we're very dependent on our caregivers, and therefore we have to co-regulate. We often say that parents, adults are the surrogate frontal lobe of the infant or the child. And so across time, you sort of back off more and more because their brain is growing and they've had all this experience and you've set the groundwork and they back off. But again, remember, it might take a little longer for a child with ADHD to get to that level of independent self-regulation. And so you play an integral role. You're the experience part. There's the brain part, and then there's the experience part, and that's where you can help your child or student. So the goal of executive functioning is self-regulation and independence. Kids want independence. They want it when they're 3. They want it when they're in middle school. They want it when they're in high school. Does that mean they can do that? Can they be independent? No. Why? Not because they're being difficult or lazy, because they are struggling to develop those skills potentially, and because just developmentally, neurotypical or not, the brain is still growing. There is this amazing opportunity for learning because the brain is thirsty for that information and opportunity, but it could be a challenge. And so you're very much working on this like sort of struggle from not being independent or being dependent to being independent. And so in order to navigate those ups and downs where the child's saying, no, I can do it myself, leave me alone, I got it, but you know they really can't, we have to sort of honor that need for independence while also helping them along to be like, I get it, and also we need to help you build those skills. So some foundational things in a relationship can really help with that. We can kind of lay the groundwork for starting to build those skills, which is a teaching process for sure, an iterative teaching process. And so some of the keys to helping children, and particularly children with ADHD, include connection, communication, and collaboration. So connection. We know that children with ADHD often receive much more negative commentary, criticism, redirection than they do positive. So it's kind of skewed, like a seesaw. If we can tip that the other way, that would be great. That means we have to work harder. We need to give more specific praise often. And so one little way to remember that is notice, name, and nurture, which can be really helpful. So notice your child doing something positive, name what you have noticed and the value that you see in that behavior, because you want more of it, right? So notice it and say it, give it a label, and then nurture it. High fives, hugs, a warm good job, whatever it is, but be really specific in that naming of what behavior they did that you love. I know, for example, I noticed that your brother ripped your artwork. I see that you controlled your anger and used your words to say how you felt. You showed a lot of effort and patience doing that. Hug, high five, done. You want to do that again and again and again all day long. Another thing that really builds connection is that special time. It's that one-to-one time where you're not teaching something, where you're not demanding or expecting something. And one thing I really loved was the idea of like calendar it, schedule it with your kid, make them so important that you put it in your calendar or your phone or whatever it is, and let them choose, let them be in charge. I want to put some parameters around it, but no matter what, it's their choice. For example, let them take like if there's some special skill they have, maybe you get to learn it from them and they get to be in charge. Communication, there's lots to learn about communication, but one of the most important things to always remember, if you're going to need to have that conversation, teach that skill, you first want to make sure your child is in a state of calm, that they're pretty regulated and they're okay and they're receptive to learning. Their frontal lobes are going to be more accessible when they are calm as opposed to not. And then finally, collaboration. They talk about a plan A, B, and C. Plan A is the adult will is imposed. It's my agenda, my way, or the highway. There's plan C where the child chooses. I don't want to do that expectation. I don't want to comply with that. And there's plan B where the adult and the child collaboratively problem solve to resolve the issue together. And the goal of that is to teach skills. It's to identify the problem, to fully hear the child's concern, the parent's concern, and to come to an agreement. Okay, let's start working on this. And so I think that's where like a lot of this executive skill model comes into play. But first you need that calm and that connection. So now I'm going to move into Dr. Dawson's work, talking a little bit about what are the executive skills, what's the model that she uses and talks about in all of her books, and then I'll try to give some examples. So there are many executive skills. She talks about how like some researchers often just lump it into 3, but that's too big and doesn't feel very actionable because it's like there's lots of things nested within there. There could also be up to 40. She goes with 12. She goes middle of the road, and I love that. So she kind of puts them into 2 groups, the thinking cognition and the doing behavior. The thinking skills sort of help you to select and achieve your goals and develop solutions to problems. So for example, you know, getting organized, like how am I going to organize my space in order to optimize my attention or things like that. And then there's the doing and the behavior. You have to be able to do certain things to reach that goal, to stay with it. So you have to inhibit certain distractions and responses, like, oh, I just want to look at my phone, but that's taking me away from my goal of getting my homework done so that I can maybe have time with my friends later or watch a show. So, and then she had started off with 11, she added this 12th one, stress tolerance. And so I put that in there because I think, you know, I don't know that we know yet, like girls versus boys, which ones are more prominent in ADHD for girls versus boys. But I could imagine, given the reports we've had from lived experiences of teens and adult women with ADHD, that, you know, emotional control and stress tolerance can be really hard. But that may be true for all children with ADHD. I don't know. I'm not sure of the research on that yet. So just keep these in mind, but you can also imagine if you're struggling all day at school with your working memory and being organized and, you know, inhibiting responses, and you get home and now you have to do more of that, you might get a little dysregulated. Kind of think of a like rough work day where you have been taking calls all day and really stressed out. By the end of the day, you're probably not going to want to sit down and do more work. And so, you know, that emotional control and stress tolerance might kick in a little bit more at home, making homework struggles or routines and chores even harder. So now I'm going to talk about the 2 parts of the model, and then within that, there's lots of other parts. Okay, I'm going to give an overview and some resources, and then I'll dive into specific examples to try to ground it a little bit more. So step 1, know thyself. You must learn what are the executive skills and strengths of my child, my student, my team, and what are the executive skills and strengths of me. And so they have, Dr. Peg Dawson has lots of great tools. It's called the Executive Skills Questionnaire. It's just an informal rating scale, and she has lots of versions of it. So it's really adapted to the different age groups, developmental and context sort of situations. But the questions are, you know, really easy. It's just statements like, you know, my child can remember 1 step at home, for example, like go get my shoes. And then you would rate it on a scale of like from never to always to somewhere in between or something like that. So there is an online version of that, and that's at her website. You can do it for yourself if you like to just like do surveys for fun and find out what your strengths and weaknesses are. I kind of like doing it sometimes. Sometimes it changes. And there's lots of all of these other versions, student, teacher, parent versions, you know, elementary versus teen versions. Those are in, I think, most of the books and the resources. So you can check out where those are and potentially access those. This is not a diagnostic tool. It is an opening to a conversation. It opens your eyes to see like, oh, my kids seems like maybe they really are struggling with time management, but actually they do pretty well with flexibility. How can we leverage this strength and this challenge? And so it just opens the conversation and also the opportunity to observe them in different settings with this lens of executive skills. Which skills are being challenged right now and which ones are a strength right now? So after you've sort of done that initial, what's the landscape? Step 2 is to sort of follow this 3-pronged approach. Modify the environment, teach the skill, and use motivation and incentives. And so throughout all of this, rest of this talk, I'll talk about these pieces in the context of some examples. But I just want to give a brief overview first. So modify the environment. Intervening at the level of the environment, the purpose of that is to change the conditions that are external to the child so that you can either improve their executive functioning by like making it a little easier, a little simpler, or reducing the negative effects of potential weak or impaired executive skills. Intervening at the level of the individual includes 2 things: teaching the skill and using motivation and incentives. And I'm mostly going to talk about modifying the environment and teaching the skills because, again, this is, you know, a year-long course, and I'm just highlighting some things that you could generalize maybe to your child and or your setting. So the purpose of teaching the skill is to help the child eventually move toward independence, teaching them and motivating them to use their own executive skills, but you're not starting there. You're teaching a procedure. You're not just handing them an alarm clock and saying, use it. You are developing a whole set of steps and going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and evaluating how it's going and seeing where the obstacles are and how to work with them to build the skills so that eventually you back off and back off and back off until they have it, and then it might slip again and you might have to re-intervene. So it's a whole process. And then one thing I'll say about using motivation and incentives is that it's so important to use a positive approach. So again, this is where that specific praise comes up. So that notice, name, and nurture. Oh, I see you made your bed and brushed your hair. You remembered those 2 steps of your morning routine. That must have been, that was great that you followed the plan, something like that. And incentive systems can also help. And that's like a whole other talk in and of itself. So moving on, let's break down the environmental piece. So there's different ways to think about the environment. You can think about the environment in terms of the physical and social environment, and you might want to remove or add something to that. Again, the goal of the environmental changes is to reduce the task, to make the task a little easier, to make the environment a little bit simpler, to allow those skills to grow. It's not forever, but it's for a while, or maybe it is forever, and that's fine. Another way to think about it is in terms of the tasks, making them shorter, making them more specific, maybe adding choice. You can also use cues to prompt behavior, and those cues can come in all different methods and formats. Verbal cues, asking questions, visual cues, using something, a hand gesture, or an actual piece of paper, or maybe it's a piece of technology. Audio, list, schedules, there's so many different cues you can use to prompt the behavior and or to continue the behavior. And also, the environment is also, like we talked about, that social relationship, the adult-child interaction. So to what degree are you going to increase your supervision and your support and your cueing, and at what points in this task? Is it going to be just before, just during, just after? Is it going to start with all 3? Yes, the answer is yes. And then it's going to move and back off to maybe I just say one thing and the child starts, and then I can back off and then just check in at the end. That's ideal. But we don't start there. We start where they are. Always developmentally, we start where they are. Skill building. So this is where this collaborative problem solving, that plan B that I was sort of briefly touching on, comes in. So you're starting with identifying the problem behavior or the challenge and how that ties to potential executive skill weaknesses, right? And also how you can leverage the strengths. And so that's why we said maybe try that questionnaire beforehand as information. So you want to identify that problem. Is it that they start chores and they don't finish them? Is it that they forget to hand in their papers? Like they did their homework, they were great, and then they forgot to bring it to school, something like that. Or is it like they're almost always late to school and the morning's really stressful and you just want to get through routine without a fight and a battle? But within that, there could be so many reasons that there's an obstacle or that it's not going well. And it could just be one, or it could be all of the executive skills involved in making that particular context of behavior happen. Set a goal. Why? You want buy-in and you want motivation and you want clarity and specificity. You want the child to be motivated to do it. So that's where that collaborative problem solving comes in. What are they going to be motivated to do? Always start where they're motivated to work. And you want it to be specific. Why? Because you want to be able to be really clear with them what it is they're trying to work for, and you want to be measurable. How can we know if it's getting better? How are we going to see the progress? Because even as we're making progress, everybody slides back, right? If you're trying to like incorporate a gym routine into your daily life, you want to increase your exercise, right? You're going to have good days and bad days. And so maybe you're going to set up a cue for yourself every morning to put your gym clothes and your sneakers out, and maybe it gets placed in the bathroom because that's the first thing you do when you get out of bed. And then that's a visual cue of like, oh, this was my goal. It's reminding me I got to go and do this. But maybe some days, your kid is suddenly sick and you can't do that. And so we always see progress not as a steady line up. It's always up, down, back, forward, back, forward. And so you want to be able to measure it so that overall you can see it's moving forward. Okay. And then you want to make a plan. And that's where I think some of that environmental piece comes in, where you're kind of listing out what are the steps and also what are the tools that we're using. And then you want to also make a plan for the supervision and the support. How are you as the adult going to support this child in building the skill and following the plan? You want to monitor and measure it and then eventually back off. Okay. Now I'm going fast. So for example, that morning routine. Just check on. Okay, we're going to get through the morning routine and then you're going to have slides with a bunch of other stuff that'll have some more concrete tools. So for example, morning routine is rough. Is it that the child is like unaware of time? Like they remember all the steps. It's not a working memory problem. Maybe it's just a keeping track of time. Or maybe there's too many steps and like they're forgetting them. And so there's different ways. Those are one problem, like two different sets of skills, the time management versus the working memory potentially. And so you want to tailor your plan to that. So maybe the goal for the child who's struggling with time is, I got to be downstairs at a certain time, and then I need to be out the door, ready to get out the door at another certain time. And you define that together, you make it really specific. And I'm going to do that 3 out of 5 days of the week, and we'll go from there. For the child who can't remember all the steps, maybe it's, I'm going to remember most of the steps, and I'm going to use this tool to help me remember most of those steps. And let's see if I can go forward a little bit. For making a plan then, you know, what tool you're going to use and how are you going to support it essentially. And so maybe for an older child, like a, you know, middle school time, it's the time issue. And so they're trying to plot out the time needed for each step, right? Like, well, how much time do I need to like twirl my hair and do my thing? You want to give a little time, but you got to also cut it off because they need to get down to make breakfast. So you negotiate how much time and you say, okay, well, we have to get out the door by 7:45. So let's work backwards. What time do you have to wake up? Okay, now you want 10 minutes to do your hair, but that means how much time are you going to have left to do the other steps? So you negotiate back and forth, back and forth. We know the steps. How much time do I need for each? For the child who can't remember all the steps, it might be using some sort of a tool to visually show these are all the steps, and they just check them off as they go. And then your role in it, maybe you're reminding the child to start. Hey, your alarm went off, get out of bed. And then maybe you're, for the first week or so, or maybe longer, you're kind of tracking the whole thing to kind of observe, where is it working, where is it not working? And then from there, you know, you're giving specific, oh, you did that thing. Oh, you did a great job. You got through all these steps upstairs. Now it's time to go downstairs. So you're prompting along the way to use the tool, and you're giving praise and feedback. Say, hey, keep going, you're doing great. And so maybe at the end of the week, each week you check in and say, how did that go? Where were the challenges? Where were the successes? And what do we want? Do we need to make this different next week? What do we need to do differently? Maybe the order of the tasks needs to be changed. And so this is a tool I've used. It's an app called Kids To-Do List. It's free, and I've used it with elementary age children. I like it because it has pictures, like pre-specified pictures, but you can also just take the pictures of the child's real context. You can add time, and it's, you know, in both formats. So if they have, whichever way, if they're up to learning time, they can kind of manage their time. And then this little star, which is usually grayed out, and then the child hits it, it makes a little ding as you go through each one. And so this is an example of a tool, but you're not just going to give the child an iPad or a phone and be like, here, do this. You're going to build the schedule together. You're going to talk about the order. You're going to set the times. And then you're going to evaluate, oh, did we have too much time for making your bed, but not enough time for getting dressed? Did it take you, were you fast to get your backpack, but it took you longer to make your breakfast? And so that's where that supervision and support and that measuring, monitoring, and adjusting goes on until you get it just right, until the kid feels like, oh, I can do this. And then you start to back off. Now it's just, hey, get your schedule ready. And then, maybe you check in just midway. Oh, you're downstairs and it's at such and such a time. What do you have to do next? Check your schedule. So just little verbal prompts. With an older child, it could be something like, all the smartphones. They can be good for something. Maybe it's a smartphone that doesn't do anything else but serve as a timer, which I've used before. And in this case, then you, again, do that whole process of negotiation, but here the focus is on time management. So you're really trying to figure out how long do they take to do each of these things, and can we tweak that? And so you can label your phone with all the steps so they remember them, and also have different auditory cues. There's all different kinds of chimes on that phone and different rings and dings. And so different ones can mean different things. You could eventually reduce it. Maybe it's not that you're planning every 2 minutes. Maybe you start to fade because you're like, oh, they have the upstairs routine and they have the downstairs routine. And all you need is like maybe 3 alarms. And so that's an example of fading it away. But you have to keep measuring it over time to see how they're progressing with it and how they feel about it. Evening routines can be a challenge too. They're tired. They've just gotten through a whole day. This is an example of, with children, sometimes with ADHD, they talk about this sort of, time blindness or not being aware of time and how it's passing and things like that. So one skill that I know Dr. Dawson talked about a lot is like really predicting, like estimating how much time does it take me, and then actually recording how much time. So this might seem a little laborious, but like, again, they already know the steps. They're just trying to figure out how long it takes them. And so this could be a simple little checklist that you have, but you're really just trying to get them to look at the clock. What time is it when I start? And then check in with the clock a few times. Oh, I thought this thing was going to take me 10 minutes and it took me 20. Oh, that's why I'm running out of time to read my book, and I just have to go to bed, and then I'm angry and upset. So you're kind of building in some incentive and choice and saying, hey, you want time to do this. Let's speed up this routine a little bit. And it's helping to build a sense of like, oh, I thought it would take 20, but it only took 10. Okay. I want to try to get through the homework example at least, because I think that's often another big struggle. But the thing is with homework, like there's 100 bazillion reasons why your child might be struggling with homework. And so again, it goes back to defining that problem, starting with the executive skill and the problem situation. Because it could be that they have no idea what their homework is, or it could be that they do know and it's so much they don't want to start. I don't blame them after a whole day of work. Or it may be that like they kind of have no problem starting, but then they just can't maintain it. They're petering out, right? And many, many other things. And so again, you want to go through that whole process of figuring out what's the problem, what's the goal, what's the plan to attack that goal, when are we going to do it, how are we going to get through it, what tools are we going to use? You use that model the whole time. And so, yeah, homework can be task initiation, sustained attention, planning, prioritizing, time management, metacognition. It's a lot of things. At the end of a school day when I'm tired. So you can think about also modifying the environment. This is a great example of like, what can we do to take the pressure down on off of the executive skills? So we can adjust the physical or social environment. Do they need a quiet location, or do they actually need a location with other people working? Sometimes just being in the presence of other people work reminds people, oh, I gotta focus. Oh, I gotta focus. I'm starting to wander. Oh, mom's on her computer doing something. I should be doing my thing too. I've definitely had my high school student learn that recently. Or maybe it's like as an older student, they realize like, oh, if I sit in my bedroom and do my work, it's not gonna work. I'm tired, I'm sitting on my bed, I'm getting distracted. And so I have a high school student who's finally come to realize, again, at their own pace, oh, it actually helps to stay at my school library. I have a free period at the end of the day, 2 days a week. And if I stay there, I am motivated because it's quiet, there's no distractions, and I now want to get my homework done before I get home. And my reward is free time, right? And so it's negotiating that physical and social environment. You can also change aspects of the task. So you can increase task specificity or create choice. Now, it might not be a choice of like, oh, just do one homework and not all of them, unless that's a plan. So maybe you still have to get it all done, but which one do you start with? And I've had it go both ways. I've had some students where like, because task initiation is really hard for them, they need to start with something easy and not so effortful. So it's like, oh, my math is really easy. It's one page. I can get it done now. And then it builds the momentum. It's like, oh, now I'm in work mode. I can go. I have a high school student who has said to me, I cannot let myself do the easy thing first. I have to start hard and then go easy, because my reward is like, oh, now I just have this 2-minute thing and I'm done. But I got through the hard thing first. So those are options. And that's why I say like, there is no one way or one solution or one tool or one strategy. You have to know the child and what they need. And it might change from day to day and week to week. So being flexible with that's really important, which is why monitoring the progress is so important. You can also use cues to prompt behavior. So again, being specific, what do you have to do first and next to sort of see, do they know what they have to do? Using lists and graphic organizers helps, but again, it's just a tool to get things out of their head. I have some students who like, they know what all their homework is, whether it's written down or not, they just have great memories so they know all of it, but they're just so overwhelmed that they can't start because it's so much. And so getting it on paper and just like doing a big brainstorm jot really helps. And then we start to prioritize in order, like, okay, what can you handle doing first, second, and third? How long is this thing going to take, and this thing and this thing? What else do you have going on tonight? And then you can also use like, if time management is an issue, like they just kind of get lost and distracted or spend too much time on an assignment, you can use different time management tools like visual timers, like the Pomodoro timer or things like that to help your students to stay focused. These are a couple of visual tools that I just wanted to share. So on Peg's website, Smart But Scattered, she has free resources, and she actually has, I didn't even realize this, I often use her books and I go to her website. She's got this awesome PDF that says, I pointed to homework, problems, and solutions. And so she goes through lots of common problems with homework and how to solve them. And she uses that model of like all the steps I just spoke about for each one. You can go there and get lots of ideas that are concrete and the steps to carry it out. She also has like an example of a daily homework planner. So, if you're trying to help your kid with executive skills related to homework, you're not necessarily going to start with all of this. This is too much. You want to start with one thing. So maybe it's just listing the assignments and knowing they have the materials. If that's where you are with forgetting materials or not having them organized, you block off the rest of that and you just work on that and you build a plan to build that skill. Then maybe you eventually get to, you know, do I need help? Who will help me? That's that self-awareness. Like, I don't understand this task. I don't have to do it alone, but this other one I can do independently. And so maybe if you're a parent at home and you are working at home and, you know, you're like, oh, my kid needs help with their homework. Oh, but they could do these two things by themselves, and then I'll be done with my work and I can help them with these other two. So you work together, you're collaborating. Or maybe it's a time issue again. So it's like, okay, how long do I think it will take and when will I start? And so you could just focus on those two columns. So don't have to use the whole thing. I know we want a little time for questions. I will just orient you maybe to the rest of the slides. Does that sound okay? And then take a few questions.
Yeah, that should be fine. And I was going to ask, I know we're approaching the end of our time and we have a lot of questions. And I was going to ask, do you and Julia have about another 15 minutes or so to hang out and maybe answer some questions after 1 o'clock, or do you guys have a hard stop?
I don't know if Julia does.
I can be a little late to my next thing.
Okay,
And if we don't get a chance to, yeah, we're happy to figure out other ways.
Maybe a few minutes are over. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Yeah, so I'll just orient you to this. So this last one talks about those like multi-step tasks and projects, which could be anything from clean your room, which can just feel beyond overwhelming for anyone. And also as specific as, you know, write an essay, but that could feel overwhelming because it's like, what do you mean I write 5 pages? Or it could be something like apply for a summer job for their teams, you know, or for college students, or apply to college. That is every imaginable executive challenge under the world because it's a big task. And so I just put some resources in here and some ideas of like, what are the possible things that could be a barrier to reaching that goal or addressing that issue? So you can read over those. And I put a couple of tools in as well. So this is an example of like a multi-step task, like writing an essay being broken down into small actionable steps. We use color coding. We did it on a Google Doc. This is the client I had. Like, I just worked with her online and, you know, broke it down into like, okay, we have 3 days. Let's work backwards. What can we do each day? This is an example maybe for a college student. This is actually from Duke, from their Learning Resource Center. And they have this calendar that's like an example of like the entire summer semester in one sheet of paper, which makes a college student start to realize there are not many days for me to do that project that feels like it's due at the end of the summer. And that can really help with that awareness of time and breaking things down. And then I think the last tool I have is just this multi-step task, or for multi-step tasks or projects, is like using those visual timers. And so these are some websites that help with that to sort of schedule both work time and break time. All right, let me stop there. And these are some resources that we have. The Duke Center for Girls and Women. We have something called e-libraries where you can search sort of by age group and look for a list of books, organizations, podcasts, webinars, scientific articles, all sorts of resources for the children in your life and the age groups, as well as, you know, all the way up to adulthood and women for, you know, people with ADHD. Chad and Attitude Magazine have great resources, articles, webinars, all the things. And then these are the 2 websites of the people I spoke about and their resources. So we just want to say thank you, and we'll take some questions.
all right. Thank you. And I am going to go ahead and launch a real quick poll that should pop up on your screen real quick. And if you could answer those questions for us, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. And we will also get started on questions. So let's see, and whatever questions we don't get through, I can save those. And is it okay, Julia and Maura, if we look at doing a Q&A document that we can send either on, well, Monday's probably a little too soon. What I might do is send a follow-up email on Monday with the recording and the slides, and then the Q&A document will probably come a little bit later. It'll take us a little time to answer those. Okay. So let's get started. We're going to look at the Q&A section. First one is, can ADHD in girls sometimes be mistaken as being on the autism spectrum?
Yes, I think the answer is that ADHD in girls can often be mistaken for autism and lots of other things too. You know, and there's absolutely, yeah, and I didn't put the numbers up here in terms of like just co-occurring conditions and rates, but you know, the rates of co-occurrence between ADHD and autism specifically are quite high, especially if you have autism, you're at higher likelihood. I feel like I saw something recently that was like 50%, although don't, I guess, quote me on that exact statistic, but it's quite high. It's lower if you have ADHD, it's lower likelihood of you also having autism, but it's still higher than just compared to the general population. And certainly, I think when we are parsing apart ADHD from autism specifically, I mean, it's tricky, right? I mean, I talked about those social difficulties that girls with ADHD can have. And that can be like, attending to your friend's conversation, keeping track of things your friend has said, like knowing how to, just being able to respond to things. And that can be, we see them often with autistic individuals and also with ADHD. So that's a long way of saying yes.
Do you think there's a correlation of ADHD and PCOS?
That is a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that there's a lot of research interest into this and ADHD and other health conditions. But I don't believe we have research into this specifically.
Okay. Somebody asked, what is mindfulness medication?
Oh, I'm sorry. That may have been a misspeak on my part. We have mindfulness meditation. And I'm sorry if the slide said medication. That was a typo. But there is mindfulness based therapies that have some emerging evidence for supporting individuals with ADHD. And so they actually weave mindfulness into the intervention. And it feels maybe a little counterintuitive when you have someone whose brain is being pulled in all these different directions, but it's helping to build that skill of being able to, focus on one thing, to be aware of when you get distracted, to engage in practice to help yourself re-regulate.
Okay, thank you. Is it possible to get these slides in Spanish?
I think quite honestly, that'd be pretty hard for us. I'm sorry.
Do you guys have anyone on staff who can present in Spanish?
We do not, unfortunately, at the moment.
Okay.
Certainly would love that in the future, but not at the moment.
No, that's something that I'm going to take back to my executive director and see what we can do about that.
I'm guessing, I'm sure, Christy, that your organization has connected with El Futuro. They are a Durham-based organization that focus on mental health supports for the Hispanic community, and they are fantastic. They actually have, I should mention, a parent training specific program for Spanish-speaking families with kids with ADHD, as well as a whole host of other resources. So while these slides specifically might not be in Spanish, they have wonderful free resources on their website. So that's El Futuro.
I can send a link to that in the follow-up information to them. I'm making it a note of it if I can read my own handwriting.
Okay, great.
Okay, there we go. Let's see. How many more questions do you think you have time for, Julia?
We keep going. Why don't we go to like maybe 5 or 10 after, and then I probably have to jump.
That's fine. And the
Okay
ones that we don't get to, we will answer in a Q&A doc and we'll send that out. Could the difference we see currently be connected to the lost girls? You must have been talking about something, and then it was, Amanda, if you want to ask that question again in reference to what you were talking about, we can look at that again.
I'm sorry, I might not be, she might have to define lost girls too. I'm not sure if I know that. I don't know more else.
Why does it take so long to diagnose young adult ages 13 to 25 women?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's so just, baseline, it can be hard to diagnose people later. If you think about it, coming back to that, like we need to see several symptoms present in childhood. That can be hard to do. Imagine back to your childhood. It's hard to remember some of these things. And we really, we need to see some indication they were there. And you add on top of that, girls who, again, are not having those overt symptoms that probably wasn't getting them suspended or in significant, big trouble. So it's kind of maybe harder to remember. There's more inattentive symptoms. We also, we know again that oftentimes that girls have been masking their symptoms. So other people, if we're asking for other raters, they might not be noticing those things. Also, we come back to that idea of comorbidities. It's very common for, by the time a young adult woman is considering ADHD, she's already gotten other diagnoses, right? There's actually a study that came out, and I don't want to butcher it, but essentially they were able to better distinguish girls with and without ADHD if they'd had an anxiety diagnosis. So like it's tricky. You're parsing apart a lot of different things. I think there's also, again, this sort of just like misunderstanding of what ADHD is in girls, and that girls can even have it. I mean, that myth still exists. So lots of reasons.
Is the ABC model considered neurodivergent affirming?
Oh, what a great question. So I don't know if I can like say if something is neurodivergent affirming or not. I guess based on my understanding of neurodivergent affirming, it would be, you know, how do we make sure that we are really, you know, respecting a person's individuality, not trying to like fix their brain in some way. And so I think that, so I don't know if like the parent management training approach necessarily like meets all of those criteria, but I do think coming back to like some of the things that Maura was saying is like really meeting a child and a family where they are, I think is a really important piece to this. You know, I think that so with parent management training, yeah, we are trying to help kids meet expectations more consistently, but there's also a really big part of it at the beginning, which is like just psychoeducation about ADHD and like how do we make sure that we understand our kids and understand the ADHD brain before we try to do anything else. So I don't know the full, like if I'm answering this question fully, but I think that would be a really important piece. As a clinician, that's something that I certainly strive to do. I don't know if I nail it every time though. Maura, would you answer? I don't know if you'd.
Yeah, I think even as a coach, again, it comes back to what are the child's goals? You know, digging into where they are, what they want for themselves, and not forcing them to do something that they're not ready for or interested in. And so I think it's really a matter of like having those conversations back and forth to really dig in and understand them and respecting what they need.
Yeah, I think a tricky thing, and this is where maybe a little bit, you know, we talk about, you know, parent management training versus coaching. And I think sometimes, you know, there are things that we have to have our kids do that they don't want to do, right? They're not motivated to do. I do think like coming to those approaches that Maura was talking about, those, can we better understand like what is going on for our kids in that moment? Like what's getting in the way? Okay, you can't get out of the school in the morning. Is it because they don't want to go to school? Or is it because they just, you know, they are motivated by something else? And a big part of what we have to figure out, yeah, what is going to motivate them? And I think with kids with ADHD, that can be especially hard because they're often looking for novelty. So you find something that is motivating, and then the next day they're no longer interested. And we know, you know, that it can be a little bit trickier. So anyway, that's just a thought about that.
All right, next one is I have teens that I mentor that are worried they may have ADHD, but have no one to ask questions. What tools could be used to assist?
So I don't know if she's talking about the kids don't have someone to talk to or she doesn't. I think, you know, our primary kind of first start, like where do you start kind of recommendation is typically the pediatrician, you know, for a couple of reasons. One, of course, you know, that they usually are the most accessible. We haven't really talked about limited access, but that certainly is a factor here too. But, you know, starting with your pediatrician hopefully will help at least generate that conversation. And if there's questions that you have or your child has, hopefully can start that. Also, your pediatrician they may be able to evaluate and diagnose ADHD, or they may refer you out, but that is usually the best place to start. Other resources like Maura had on the slide, so other good places to get questions answered. Certainly, we are building up our website to answer more and more questions, but Chat and Attitude are also have been around for many years and have some really good resources too.
Yeah, and I think you alluded to the answer to this next question a little bit, but what physicians are required for accurate diagnosis, which I think you've covered, and Maura had some examples. And it says how many are required to maintain the person struggling with ADHD. So I think that's going to vary from person to person and their specific, the way their disorder affects them, right?
So let me see if I can find what do you know what I got a little lost on the number.
That's okay, no worries. It just says how many are required to maintain the person struggling with ADHD. So I think it's how many
symptoms?
Providers, I think.
Providers. Okay. Well, once I think it is going to be individual. Sometimes, you know, you can get all the support you need, you know, both evaluation and treatment from your physician. Other times you're going to need more people on your team. And I think that actually comes to a point that maybe we haven't expressed so far, is that ADHD is a huge spectrum, right? When someone tells you they have ADHD, you don't really know what that means, right? I mean, for one thing, again, we talked about, you know, there's the inattentive presentation, there's the hyperactive impulsive presentation, there's the combined presentation. Like, so it really is, it's a really, you know, what we call heterogeneous disorder, right? It looks lots of different ways. And also there are different kind of levels, right? There are people who really tremendously struggle with their ADHD at a level that they require, you know, intervention throughout their lives. And then there's people who are more in the middle who don't, and it really depends on their environment, right? Or what's going on in their lives. And so I think that what is needed for an individual person is really going to vary based on them as a person and also based on their circumstances.
How you doing on time, Julia?
I'm doing well. Let's do two more.
Okay. I'm going to skip around just a bit because we are
Okay.
going to take all these and put them in a document. So we will get
Okay.
to everybody's question. How can a parent support a female girl with ADHD if the mom also has ADHD?
Oh my goodness, what a great question. And that is also really common. I think I mentioned this
Mhm.
runs in families. You know, I think it's about 50% of kids with ADHD are gonna have a parent with ADHD. So I think my first off is making sure the parent themselves gets the support they need. It's going to be so hard for an adult with ADHD, right, to do all the things that Mara was just talking about. Also, you know, parent training, all these things do require a lot from family parents. And if they themselves have ADHD, it's going to help your kid the most if we help you first, right? It's like that whole adage of putting on your mask first before you help other people. So that's a really important part of this. So that would be my recommendation, but also validating that this is really hard. And when you have ADHD running in your family and it is really hard. It's hard to parent.
Okay, let's see. We'll do one more live. Let's see. If a child has regulation challenges because of another diagnosis, like autism or generalized anxiety disorder, etc., won't there be limited benefit to increasing executive functioning skills?
I can answer that from a sort of parent training, and then maybe I'll pass it to you, Mara. I mean, I think that's a really great point for a couple of reasons. One, again, comorbidities often are more the rule than the exception. And I think that just generally, right, if we're thinking about intervention for someone with ADHD, we need to, you know, look at the individual and make sure that we're like, you know, what is the thing that is most impairing at this moment. Sometimes I will meet with a family and I'll say, you know what, actually, I think we first have to manage the mood symptoms, right, or the anxiety before we can dive into more ADHD specific treatment. So I think it is really looking at the individual and trying to figure that out from an intervention standpoint. Mara, I don't know if you could talk about like from the coaching standpoint.
I completely agree. I think that, you know, you can tell when the executive skills development piece of things is like the icing on the cake, but you have to start with the cake and build that. And so if you are struggling with things like anxiety or other, you know, other conditions that need management, I agree with starting with that first. Like, I don't, you know, in coaching, I would not want to, and I would be honest and say, like, I don't think coaching is somewhere that we can start. I think that these are other resources to start with. But I think it's also possible if those things are managed, because I do have clients who have, for example, you know, autism plus ADHD and things like that. But like, if it's so many supports along the way, they're just ready for it now, you know, like age-wise, and because they've built lots of skills, you know, along the way and have lots of supports, and now they're ready for this, and it's bringing them to that next level of management, independence, and self-regulation. So it really depends on where they are in their journey of getting support.
And I'll share, if you're not super familiar with the term executive functioning and executive functioning skills and like what all that encompasses, you know, I'll send some links to articles that I typically send to families. A lot of times when I'm working with families, I'll say, have you ever heard the term executive function or executive functioning skills? And they're like, what's that? I'm like, well, once you read it, you'll understand why it's so important really for everyone to know what they are. And if there's an issue, kind of how to address it. It was very enlightening to me. My daughter's 13 and has autism. We also suspect ADHD. To learn what those were, and then it really helped me be able to talk with the school and teach them, like, look, this is what this means. Here's where I think she's having difficulties because I see this. Can we please create some goals around helping address these at school? So that was really helpful. But I know we're out of time. Thank you so much. There was such a so many questions, we couldn't get to them all, but like I said, we're going to save them and we are going to do a Q&A document, and Mara and Julia will take a look at those. It might take a while, a few days, possibly up to a week. We don't want to rush you guys, but I will send it out after the follow-up email on Monday. It'll take us a couple days to get that out, but thank you so much. There was so much interest. We're going to look at the questions, and maybe that can also help us decide on maybe some content for another webinar from you guys. Can we convince you to come back?
Yes, definitely.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you so much to Julia and Maura for joining us and giving us this awesome information. We truly appreciate it. And we hope to see all of you again soon. Have a great weekend, everyone. Happy Mother's Day.
You too.